They came running into the kitchen calling out, "Hitler's dead, Mum, Hitler's dead." They were so pleased to be actually telling my grandmother something that they'd heard on the tram coming home from school, I think. Unfortunately, it wasn't Hitler who was dead, as we all know. Of course, it was Hinkler, the famous aviator, who unfortunately met his end in the same month and the same year that Hitler came to power in Germany, January 1933. When war broke out on September the 1st, 1939, Lionel was living in Hastings Parade, Sydney. He applied almost immediately for aircrew training with the Royal New Zealand Air Force on the 26th of September 1939 and was enlisted on the 9th of April 1940 at Levin for initial training. Lionel's younger brother Oliver also enlisted in the Royal New Zealand Air Force, training as a wireless operator. Now, around the same time, my mother Gwendolen Goldsmith enlisted in the New Zealand Army, training as a mechanic and truck driver, and she was stationed, I think, at Fort Dorset. My mother Gwendolen often said that her family would have been so different if only Lionel had returned. She honestly believed that the quarrels and the divisions within the family would never have happened. She was referring to one of her older brothers, Lionel Manuel, who was the fourth child in a family of 7 children, of which my mother was the baby. These were the children of Joseph Isaac and Deborah Goldsmith of Washington Avenue, Brooklyn, Wellington, New Zealand. My mother seemed to believe that Lionel had a certain strength. He'd left school and was sent to work for his uncle in a furrier business in Dunedin. And then he joined with other employees in his uncle's business to strike and demand a raise. He was involved in a revolt and works demonstrations that took place at Lambton Quay during the Depression, and I know I would have loved him. I'm actually quite amazed because recently I found my mother's had actually kept all the letters that she had received from her 2 brothers, and when I look back at it, and particularly as a mother myself, I realise how young these uncles of mine were. One of them was 20, and they're on the other side of the world. They don't know what's in front of them, and I just realised how important family was. And one of them was written by Oliver, and he would have been, say, 20 or 21 at the time, and he's writing about the letters that he has just received from the family. He's over in Canada training, and he just says that he had a funny feeling the whole day to think that I'm so far away from you, and I'd give anything to be with you all once again. I would have loved to have done more for you than the little I have. And he says, I will never let these letters out of my sight and will keep them all my life. He tells his family not to worry about his safety while he's in Canada training as a wireless operator, because he said, I'm going to be here for 6 months, and by that time the war will be over, which of course it wasn't. I look back and I see my parents, not my parents, but my grandparents, in a very different way. They sent, well, they didn't send, but they had Lionel go off to war the month that war was actually declared. They had their youngest son, Oliver, who they had to actually give permission to go off to war. And then later on, my mother, who had already enlisted, also went off overseas. And I just can't imagine what it would be like for parents knowing that they really may not see these children again. My mother was on leave at the time when notification came that Lionel was missing. My grandmother, who was standing on the front veranda, saw the telegram arriving, and she screamed out, "Not Lionel, not Lionel." The details of what happened after the plane was shot down were made evident from the investigation by the Missing Research and Inquiry Service in 1946, and I'd like to read from that document. Result of investigation and findings. As instructed, I proceeded to the town of Wellington for the purpose of establishing the burial particulars of the 6 missing members of Lancaster DX675 and discovered that an aircraft had crashed between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock on September the 22nd, 1943, in a wood near a coal pit 3 kilometres southeast of the town. I visited the coal pit and interrogated Herr Meyer, who was on duty at the pit at the time the aircraft crashed. He stated that the aircraft crashed in flames. 2 men survived the crash and were captured, the other 6 men all losing their lives. Of these, 3 were found in the woods and 3 were still in the aircraft. He remembered that one of the dead men found in the woods had the name New Zealand on the shoulder of his uniform. The bodies were taken by the Luftwaffe to Duingen and were buried in the local cemetery there. Records of the mayor of Duingen showed that 6 unknown airmen were buried in the local cemetery on the 23rd of September 1943. 3 of them in grave number 1, row 11, and 3 in grave number 1, row 12. I visited the cemetery and found that the grave was actually a communal one, consisting of the first 2 graves of row 11 and 12. The men had apparently been buried with full military honours by the Luftwaffe, a major, 2 captains, 3 lieutenants and 15 army being present. The grave, which is in the eastern corner of the cemetery, was exceptionally well cared for. It had 2 small trees growing on it and was covered with plants which were in bloom. On the stone was written, "In memory of 6 British airmen killed, 22nd of September 1943. I am fully aware of the distressing nature of this information, Mr. Goldsmith, and I would ask you once again to accept my deepest sympathy in your great sorrow. Yours faithfully, Sergeant T.A. Barrow, Air Secretary." Not only did this this military funeral take place only 100 kilometres away from where Jews were being killed for being Jews, but I often wondered whether the Luftwaffe and the major and the lieutenant or whoever were there had any idea that the person that they were burying was actually Jewish. The International Red Cross collected items from these bodies, and they returned to my grandparents 2 items that were on my uncle's body at the time. One of them was a Jewish mezuzah, which he always wore round his neck, and the other, which they actually said was a lucky charm, and another item which they listed as a chest warmer was actually a tzitzis, which is often worn by Jewish men. My mother, who was the youngest in the family, who was the baby, I think she felt a real need to do what her brother had actually asked her to do, and this brother, who had now been killed, had actually said to her before he left, and she was about 17, he said to her, "Baby, if anything happens to me, you're like the next boy," she was the tomboy in the family, "you take my place." And when my uncle was killed, my mother decided that rather than just stay in the New Zealand Army back in New Zealand, that she would volunteer to go overseas. And that's exactly what she did. This would have been an added, I think really, I can't imagine again how my grandparents must have felt. They would have been proud of her, but having already lost 1 son, having another son still away overseas fighting, and then having their youngest child, a girl, volunteering to go overseas would have been, I think, very, very difficult for them. I'm also surprised, my mother often told me about how she felt that she had to take his place. One of the letters that Lionel wrote to her, he said, you know, "How's your course going?" And he said, "I hope that you don't have to go overseas, because I think it's enough that Oliver and I are actually overseas fighting. I think that's enough for one family." So my mother may have actually forgotten that letter or decided to disregard it, because in fact she did decide to go overseas. And I think one of the the really sad things about war is that we forget what's actually happening to those people back home. And I know my mother said that after Lionel was killed, it was like her parents really aged. She said her father, she stopped in to see him, she took a detour, and she said he was sitting amongst the bales of material just sobbing, and he said he just couldn't come to terms with the fact that he was alive and that his son had been killed. And again with my grandmother, she was never really the same. I think also one of the things that we sometimes forget, and I think we're reminded these days particularly, much more than in those days, is the effect that war has on young people and how difficult it is for them to actually adjust to civilian life again. And when I look back at my mother's life, and I think about her return to New Zealand after being in the army, after living a very, very different life from the rather conservative life that she did live in Wellington, and then having to adjust to living at home again, you know, doing what your parents said, and I can see that it had an effect on her life. She had a boyfriend in the army. She didn't marry him, and she then had a broken engagement. She decided then that she would go and work in Australia, where her sisters, her married sisters were, and I can see then that there was a certain amount of not being quite settled. And I know that this was something that she did feel, because she told me that after the war, her and Oliver sometimes used to just go for a drive. They'd take their parents' car and they'd just go for a drive, and they'd just go and sit quietly with their own thoughts about what had happened. And looking back also, I think that Oliver may have actually, like many of those returning, felt a certain amount of what we now know is survivor's guilt, because he was the brother who they had most fear for, and yet he returned. But also I think he felt a certain amount of guilt, because I remember him telling us how he felt when he was waiting for Lionel's plane to come back, and how they'd count the planes as they returned, and when he realized that his brother's plane had not returned, he just fell to pieces and he just sobbed and sobbed. And his brother Lionel had actually finished his tour of duty. He was actually waiting for Oliver so that they could both return to New Zealand together. Now, my mother remembers my grandfather asking my grandmother, of course after the war, if she would like to make that journey to Germany to visit Lionel's grave. But her response was that Lionel isn't there. Now, in the years that followed, two of my aunts named their sons in Lionel's memory, and I understand my late grandmother's remarks that Lionel isn't there, because I understand that where he was in the hearts and minds of his family, who, despite all the differences they had, spoke of him lovingly and remembered him always. This film is in memory of my uncle, whom I never met, Warrant Officer Lionel Manuel Goldsmith. His Hebrew name, Lapidoth Manuel Ben Yosef Yitzhak, dead at 27, and all those others who, as a result of war, never returned home, but were never forgotten.